Welcome back to another episode where we're going to be discussing Jürgen Habermas' book Theory and Practice. And we're today going to be looking at Chapter 5 on Hegel's political writings. So, one housekeeping item I'd like to mention is following from the last recording on the transition from Kant to Hegel, especially with a view toward the development of a phenomenological standpoint, is the point that for Kant, the sense in which our concepts can transcend our subjectivity involves our experience of them as concepts embedded in our experience. So, for example, mathematics is possible because we have embedded in our experience, and experience would include our entire cognitive awareness of what we are experiencing. So embedded within that experience of a particular object would, for example, involve the concept of some sort of unity, which you could say would be prior to our being able to formulate concepts like the number one, or the idea of unity, being able to do mathematics, be able to point to something as a singular unified object so that we could consider it to be a substance of some kind, so that we could point to it, so that we could give it a name, so that we could be able to frame more complex substances, more complex subjects based upon that original founding concept that's already there embedded in our experience. So just to make sure that that idea is coming through clearly, if I have a book before me, the concept that's latent, that's hidden perhaps in my experience of seeing the book, is the idea of oneness, the idea of unity. And that founding concept makes other concepts that I can build upon it possible, makes language possible, makes counting possible. So it's an example of how Kant used subjectivity to begin to try to find a sense in which we could look at things objectively, in as much as in order to be able to think about these things at all, we have to already have those concepts embedded in our mind. And this emphasis that I want to bring on experience of concepts, maybe tacit, maybe latent, maybe hidden, but always already there in a sense within our experience, allows for subjectivity to emerge as the major focus of idealistic philosophy. It's sometimes called idealistic philosophy, continental philosophy after Immanuel Kant, which involves going beyond the parts and seeing how the parts relate to the whole. Okay, so bringing it back to these two basic questions, it seems like Hegel is delimiting philosophy in a way that seems less than intuitively true. It doesn't seem like what he's saying really fits our picture of what philosophers can do. Why can't a philosopher sit down and write about the way that things ought to be? Again, the text reads, philosophy cannot instruct the world about what it ought to be. So how can we understand this? My suggestion is that a way to bring this chapter together, to make it read more smoothly, continuously, is to bring in the Aristotelian idea about deliberative action as a foundation for thinking about ethical activity, thinking about what sorts of things are ethical or non-ethical. because at the end of the day, it's going to be our theory of action, and it's going to be actions themselves where we find the true foundation, the true context in which we can start thinking about what is ethical and what is not ethical. So, just to begin to elaborate that theory, which is a theory that we're going to find in Hegel, it begins as follows. First, there has to be a thing that is desired. So, this is going to be an object of desire. You could say that this is, from the standpoint of the one who desires it, considered something good, considered something worth achieving, having, for whatever reason. So in of itself, it may be considered a good, something that the subject wants. Okay, and that's leaving out the question of any kind of objective viewpoint about what sorts of things are good to desire and what sorts of things are not. Just from the standpoint of the person doing the desiring, the presumption, let's say, is that what is desired as a good. So the second step is, as long as we're talking about deliberative action, which is going to be an important part of the puzzle of ethical thinking, as long as this getting to the thing you desire involves deliberation, there's going to be some sort of thinking about how best to achieve that end. So this theory of action that's being generated, that's being gotten underway, is not one that just involves haphazardly kind of running after whatever, looks good, or, just absentmindedly chewing gum or something like that. But in order for the ethical dimension to enter the picture, the action has to be deliberative. I suppose you could say that from a common sense standpoint, if somebody commits a crime that is not deliberate, most people wouldn't consider the ethical dimension to enter the picture. If somebody unknowingly, fully beyond their knowledge or any awareness, caused something bad to happen, we wouldn't normally say that they're guilty of some sort of ethical malfeasance. Okay, so that's the second part. And the third part would be taking action. So the three parts are, together, the thing that's desired, deliberating about how best to achieve that goal, getting the thing you desire, and then part three, taking action. Now, I was saying that this is an Aristotelian theory, but a lot of Aristotle does show up in Hegel. And I'm going to read a quote where Hegel seems to be thinking along these lines. So this is on page 177 in the section entitled The Relation of Theory and Praxis. And it reads, "In the last section of the Logic, the relation of subjective activity directed toward a goal to the idea of the good is defined unambiguously. Where the idea of the good is conceived as a directive for such action, it is unavoidably admixed with subjectivity. For then, theory, as a, quote, domain of transparent thought, abstractly confronts reality as a, quote, undisclosed domain of darkness. This viewpoint of subjective consciousness is abstract because it disregards the knowledge which always links us with reality at this level of action. For praxis here means not instrumental action and technical disposition over an objectified nature, but instead morality in Hegel's sense as political action and interaction within a living context. This praxis always moves within a reality which reason has imagined for itself." Okay, So we can stop there and just try bringing those elements together to substantiate that picture of Aristotelian deliberation as working behind the scenes. So first, we start with the idea of good, and there it is in the section where the idea of the good is conceived as a directive for action. It is unavoidably admixed with subjectivity. So here we have the subject desiring the good, for then theory as a domain of transparent thought always confronts reality as an, quote, undisclosed domain of darkness. And there you could say that through the lens of theory, theorizing about how best to achieve that end, reason comes up against the possibility of being in error, the mind not quite seeing clearly enough or distinctly enough how to bring that good into being. Now, the third part, the actual action, enters with that sentence where the word praxis appears. For praxis, which here means not instrumental action and technical disposition over an objectified nature, but instead morality in Hegel's sense as political action and interaction within a living context, this praxis always moves within reality, which reason has imagined for itself. So there you have action as stage 3, and it's all tied together in that last clause there within a reality which reason has imagined for itself. So there's the way in which theory about what's good, what's desired, is brought together with some deliberation, theorizing about how to achieve it with political action. So, one more time, this praxis always moves within a reality which reason has imagined for itself. Okay, so if we take those elements and we line them up with the categories of theory and practice, we can relate the first 2 stages to theory and then the last stage to action. And then I think we can understand Habermas's discussion here, how Hegel's theory fits together, how Hegel's can be read, maybe with better comprehension. So the philosopher is going to be concerned with the first 2 stages. What should we desire? What should be considered good? And the second stage, how should we achieve it? But what the philosopher is not going to be concerned with is the actual carrying out of the action. At that point, the philosopher takes off his philosopher hat and puts on his political hat. Or rather, I should say, politician's hat, because at that point, he's employed in a different way. He has a different social function, which is sort of the way in which Hegel is thinking of how these categories get divided up. So what happens is, in this discussion of how the philosopher relates to society, the philosopher gets sequestered on the side of deliberation and the side of theory. And the real actors, the real people who take action, the revolutionaries who bring some of these theories into being, are on the other side. And the difficulty for philosophy is always that a philosopher who's just doing the theorizing, who's just doing the deliberating, never quite knows what's going to happen once action is taken. And I think probably we've all had some sort of experience of that in our lives. Maybe there was something out there that we desired. Maybe we thought for a little bit about the best way to achieve that. And then we took action. And we were never quite sure at the moment of taking action exactly whether our theorizing and deliberating would be adequate to take us through realizing the object of our desires. So this is always a problem for the philosopher. This is a position that the philosopher is in. The philosopher is sequestered away from the actual action taking in society. So in a certain sense, the philosopher is definitely on the side of trying to decide the way things ought to be, both from the standpoint of deciding what's good or desirable and theorizing about the best way to get to it. On the other hand, the philosopher is not involved in the actual change, the actual daily working out of the change that occurs in society in a real concrete way. So I think it's in that latter sense that the philosopher can't actually contribute, can't actually be a part of the unfolding of history, not to the extent that the philosopher can, as a philosopher, engage in revolutionary activity, because at that point, we're taking off the philosopher hat and putting on the revolutionary hat, and you're no longer involved as an activist in the carrying out of the activity. Perhaps it gets a little bit murky at that point, but I would just say from that point, it might be good to look at a couple more quotes. So if we take a look again at another section, this is 182. That division between the philosophers and the ones who conduct the business of the world spirit, for which the reasons are presented in the logic, already begins to delineate itself, a division of labor by which, in his lectures on the philosophy of history, Hegel wants to exclude a feedback effect of theory on praxis. So there we have the division of labor. We have two different sorts of employments. Hegel wants to keep these categories completely separate. Perhaps it gets murky if we start to think, well, why can't a politician be on both sides of the fence, be philosophical and carrying out the action implied by the theory? But you could say that these two categories are present within that one person. And perhaps what Hegel has in mind is something more on the line of an academic philosopher. And then where it says Hegel wants to exclude a feedback effect of theory on praxis, there again, the idea is here we have theory, here we have praxis. On the one side, we have theory trying to deliberate. On the other hand, we have action being taken. And there's only a limited extent to which a philosopher can enter the realm of action and begin prescribing, suggesting, deliberating about what sorts of action should deliberately be taken and still remain in the role of a traditional philosopher. A philosopher deals traditionally with much broader questions, frames reality much more broadly. Okay, so the last thing I'll mention for today is this point that Hegel makes about positivity. And if we want to understand Hegel's idea of history and how history changes, which is something that's been discussed already for a couple of episodes, a new term that Habermas throws at us is this term positivity. So you can think of the existing state of affairs in a society as having having an achieved reality, and you can label that positivity in relation to something that is working to change that reality, which you could call negativity. And you always have these two poles in history. There's this positive pole. This is the achieved, sustained reality. And on the other hand, you have some other element, which is a force in history that's working to change that already achieved reality by negating it. And when it negates it, it becomes the new positive reality when that reality has finally superseded the one that's come before it. And a second look back at Aristotle, I think, is one that can help explain what Hegel has in mind here, which is the Aristotelian idea of substantial change. So when you look at a substance, there are two kinds of change. There's accidental change and there's substantial change. As an example of substantial change, you could say something like Socrates getting a suntan would be a change with respect to the accidental properties that make Socrates who he is. A substantial change would involve Socrates ceasing to exist, becoming one with the earth, decaying into inert matter, and finally being transformed into something else, some other type of substance. So the underlying thing that persists through accidental change is taken by Aristotle to be the true substance of Socrates. And when that substance changes, then accidental change is suddenly forced into a new concept. It's now being forced to apply to the next substance that the thing becomes. Okay. Now, if we take that basic framework and apply it to political states, we could say substantial change involves a change in constitution, involves a revolution. Accidental change might involve ways in which society tries to adjust itself to the different political and social forces that are driving it to change. So, at some points in history, philosophers might be involved in trying to create adjustments in society, and at other points in history, might be involved with more revolutionary moments. But if we want to understand Hegel's discussion of the dialectic of history, we can say that accidental change would involve merely the negating of certain positive aspects of society without overthrowing society as a whole, whereas a revolutionary moment would involve the negating of the entire realized social order as it has come to exist. So with that, I'm just going to leave off with a final quote from Habermas. Hegel can relieve philosophy of its critical efforts to confront the complacent existence of social and political life with its own concept after he has recognized, with a sigh of relief, that the spirit has lurched forward, that the principle of reason has entered into reality and has become objective. Now it is only a question of time and contingent circumstances before the new epoch will stride over the resistance of those who oppose it impotently and gain universal recognition for its principle. Only now can Hegel content himself with recognizing the spirit which has become objective, call it by its name, and turn critically against those who have not yet comprehended the lesson of world history. That is the tenor of the polemic against the Württemberg estates. Quote, "They seem to have slept through these last 25 years," Hegel writes in 1817. Quote, "Probably the richest which world history has ever enjoyed, and for us the most instructive, because our world and our conceptions belong to them." And there is perhaps the answer, the final answer to the question of how Hegel views philosophy in relation to history, that if we look at history, history has lessons to teach us. And from the standpoint of knowledge, from the standpoint of having complete knowledge, or more relatively complete knowledge, we have to see the whole. And you could say that even the philosopher who is trying to understand society and may be involved in changing society won't be able to fully understand it until those changes have fully matured, grown to their final form, and manifested themselves. And so, from the standpoint of knowing and being able to really give better answers to the meaning of history, it's only the philosopher who sees the end development of things who can really learn the full lessons of history and adapt them and develop them for the theories that may emerge after that lesson has been learned. So with that, I'll say good night, and that's it.